Hello and welcome to Religion at the Edge, Findings from the Cascadia Project. My name is Emma Robinson, and I am the project manager of the Nonreligion in a Complex Future project, who has co-organized today's event alongside the Center for Studies in Religion and Society at the University of Victoria. As we begin, please join me for a land acknowledgement. While we gather virtually for this event from places near and far, we acknowledge the Indigenous peoples of all the lands we are on today, and acknowledge the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples across Canada. The Nonreligion in a Complex Future project is based at the University of Ottawa. Please join us as we pay respect to the Algonquin people, who are the traditional guardians of this land. We acknowledge their long-standing relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. We acknowledge the traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old, and we honor their courageous leaders, past, present, and future. Thank you. I will now turn things over to Laurie Beeman, the principal investigator of the Nonreligion in a Complex Future project. Over to you, Laurie.
Thank you so much, Emma. And I do want to acknowledge Emma's contribution to the organization of this event. Emma's the project manager for the Nonreligion in a Complex Future project. And she's absolutely invaluable in making sure that things run smoothly, and as well participates in the intellectual direction of the project, and liaising with partner organizations such as the Center for Studies in Religion and Society. And we're co-hosting the event today with them. I know the rule was that you're not supposed to be on camera unless you're speaking, Sarah, Patricia, and Paul, but I want to invite you to turn your cameras on so this looks like a panel from the outset rather than me kind of, and then you appear magically. Well done, Sarah, well done. It's a delight. I think it's a delight. It's a delight to host you today and to be having this conversation. I can't tell you how excited I am about this project. I've been hearing little bits of it for a while. I've heard Paul present on it a number of times, and it's a fascinating project, and it's my honor to host a celebration of the book that comes out of the project. The book is entitled Religion at the Edge, Nature, Spirituality, and Secularity in the Pacific Northwest. And the co-editors of that book, Paul Bramadat, Patricia O'Connell-Killen, and Sarah Wilkins-Laflamme are with us here today to discuss the book and its findings. And when I was negotiating this panel with Paul, I said, I don't want a kind of typical book panel. I'd really like it if you could talk to us about the project and your findings rather than chapter by chapter, which is what sometimes people do when they're doing book launches. And I think that's what we're going to do today. Although once they have the floor, they can do whatever they want, of course. I would like to just mention quickly Paul Bramadat and introduce each of our panelists. Paul Bramadat is professor and director of the Center for Studies in Religion and Society at the University of Victoria. He is a collaborator on the Nonreligion in a Complex Future project, and the center is a partner organization, as I've already mentioned. Paul has a wide range of research interests. I'm imagining that many of you who are here know what his research interests are, but it's incredible. He's doing everything from religion in the public sphere, religion and spirituality, health, security, civil society. There's really not much you don't do, Paul, frankly, in the area of thinking about religion and non-religion. And I want to congratulate Paul on his recent SSHRC Insight grant for global spiritualities, local bodies, modern postural yoga in Canada and the United States. So congratulations, Paul. Patricia O'Connell-Killen is Professor of Religion Emerita and Humanities Division Faculty Research Fellow at Pacific Lutheran University. She's a historian and an expert on Christianity in North America, and she's written extensively about the Cascadia region. And some of you may know her work with Mark Silk. I think that's, Patricia, where I first came across your work and your thinking. So welcome to the panel to you. And last but not least, Sarah Wilkins-Laflamme is Associate Professor in the Department of Sociology and Law at Waterloo University. Sarah is also a collaborator on the Nonreligion in a Complex Future project. Sarah, too, has a wide range of interests And in the interest of, also promoting, just wanted to mention Sarah's I think it's your most recent book with Joel Thiessen, None of the Above. And so we all share an interest in religion and society and non-religion in society. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to the three of you to tell us a little bit about this project and the book.
Thanks very much, Lori. You can all hear me? Yeah, okay. So my job today is to kind of set the stage a little bit for the conversation we're going to have. We're going to try to focus on those aspects of our book that have most relevance to thinking about non-religion in a complex future. So I'm going to give you a bit of a sketch of the architecture of the project and then give you a couple little pieces from the chapters that I contributed. Oh, okay. So here's the basic structure of the book. The project was a 4-year Shirk Insight project, which was very lovely to have that. I was the PI and had a very good team working with me. The team included historians, religious studies folks, anthropologists. We had a research coordinator. We had quant people and qualitative people. We had the benefit of the CSRS administrative backbone to kind of keep the thing moving. That was really useful. The deliverables, to use Shirk language, articles, book, website, 2 formal reports on the data from Sarah Wilkins-LaFlamme that are available on her site and that are just fantastic. If you want a kind of a thumbnail sketch of the data and the way what we were looking for, and then all the regular academic sessions one would expect, the AAR, the CSSR, etc. For those of you who are from Europe or from elsewhere in North America and who aren't maybe familiar with this particular geographical metaphor, Cascadia, or the Pacific Northwest, we use the term Cascadia to refer sort of elliptically to the kind of mythos of the space that normally we think of as being inclusive of Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia. Although when you look at the map here, you can see that it doesn't quite include all of British Columbia, and it includes a bit more than those states. But generally speaking, we're talking mainly about those 3 states. Population is around 16 million. About 80% or so, a little more, live in 4 urban clusters, basically between Vancouver and just south of Portland. And that is kind of an important route technologically, culturally, and I think geographically between those 2 spaces. Really, the most of the population lives in what we think of as the Pacific Slope. So that's on the west side of that purpley range going down the middle. Just to give you a sense, I think a future project would need to look at the way religion, spirituality, and post-religion manifest themselves in the more rural areas. So why ask? Well, I'm a Winnipegger, as some of you know. I lived most of my life on the prairies, some in Ontario and some in Quebec. And when I moved out to the West Coast, I mean, so clearly we were in a different space, culturally, geographically, politically, and many of the things I had come to assume would be the normal way the world unfolds didn't unfold that way. One of the things I think Sarah's probably going to talk about is a high percentage of nuns or no religionists in the region. Pretty advanced state of de-Christianization. I think Patricia will likely talk about the long history of no religion, post-religion, irreligion, secularity, whatever you want to call it, in the region, on both sides of the border, really. There's a quite strong regional narrative. I mean, people here recognize what here means, and there is a strong sense of this being different than there, whether there is understood to be Calgary, Toronto, the prairies, or whether there is understood to be Boston, New York, Chicago. So there's a strong sense of this as a space. And this is a possible test site for new metaphors or new tools we can use to analyze religion and irreligion. And that's kind of where I kind of come in, or what I'm going to share from one of my chapters. We can talk more about this in the discussion if you want, but this is kind of a sketch of the methodology. We did a very good survey, which has been extremely useful for our analysis and thereafter. We did focus groups, interviews, oral histories in Portland, Seattle, Victoria, and Vancouver, because we did focus on those 4 urban centers, though the survey, of course, was much more, it didn't have these kind of urban limitations. And we did archive visits in 4 cities, and we were able to kind of cluster together data related to census, policies, news on religion in the region. And this created quite a new source of data or pool of data that all of the chapter authors were able to use, and that will be able to be used by other scholars in the future. So when we're thinking about the data that we collected and the region in which many of us live, the usual suspects categorically continue to work just fine. Religion, spirituality, no religion, irreligiosity, secularity, these are fine. And I think they're still quite useful. But I had this hunch when I moved here and then kind of running up to the imagination of the project itself, that the existing categories, metaphors that we were using to think about what we were experiencing and seeing might be missing something. And so I began to have this felt sense that there was a kind of a meta-narrative that was governing the way we think about religiosity in the natural world. And so I came up with the phrase reverential naturalism. I'm not totally married to it, but it's pretty workable. It tests pretty well, you could say, out here in ordinary conversation. So the category might allow us to ask, I think, additional questions about what religion and spirituality might look like in the region. So just very briefly, by way of a thumbnail sketch, when we think about naturalism, we're really thinking about some sense of the natural world, some sense of the world that emphasizes materialist, this worldly explanation and suggests that that's sufficient for accounting for all observable phenomena. And the Cascadia variant, reverential naturalism, accepts, in fact, begins with, assumes scientific approaches to nature, but nonetheless isn't kind of a flat naturalism. It's a naturalism that frames a natural world in ways that are redolent. And here, this is an important term in the sense that, smells like mysticism, panentheism, inclusive forms of theism, etc. So it's a loose set of concomitant attitudes, its assumptions, habits, practices with respect to a breathtaking natural world, which seems to be the kind of governing kind of default orientation. When we were thinking about the project, I thought, well, maybe I'll just use the sort of standby terms of eco-spirituality, nature, religion, religious naturalism, and so forth. But those terms didn't feel quite right because they're somewhat inert. Not entirely, but they're somewhat more inert here than elsewhere, or this at least was my sense and part of the thing I kind of wanted to test or flesh out or think through with my colleagues. I want to just underline something else, though, that I mentioned earlier, that this is a variant of naturalism, more so than it's a variant of religion, spirituality. That might just reflect that, now in BC, over 50% of people are of no religious or, don't claim religion in most surveys. And it might be that signals or enables a kind of a turn in the conversation. So we don't have time to go into all the evidence, but there's plenty of it. And you'll just have to read this fabulously beautiful book, which includes on the cover a picture I took from my kayak, I'm proud to say. Anyway, so in the book, we talk about various ways of thinking about the data that we encountered. One pastor, I think he said, Cascadia represents the beginning of post-Christian America. It's just the front end of the post-Christian story in America. America in 50 years is going to be completely different than what it is now. And what you're seeing in Portland will be in Kansas in 10 years. And, one other person he was talking about his conversation with his graduate supervisor, and he is a Muslim architect. And he said, well, why are you talking about mosque design? He said, spirituality is in the forest. And he said, my mind was blown. I'm like, oh, okay. And I suspect that might be a very West Coast way of thinking because I'd never heard it articulated in other parts of the world. So I won't go through all of them, but one person said the default assumption in Cascadia is that spiritual practice, rather than prayer or meditation, in some organized fashion is walking in nature. That's almost a ubiquitous feeling here, he said. the one clergy member said that's kind of the public narrative. This is a place where nature-based spirituality tends to be our native language. So I'll just stop here and turn it over to, I think Sarah is next. Thanks, everybody. And I look forward to hearing your questions and talking through these concepts.
Okay, great. Thanks, Paul. So I was going to take a few minutes with everyone today, just to touch on a few of the chapters that are in this fabulous book, and look at specifically one question that there's many questions that this book answers, but one question that may be more interesting for the NCF project or those of you working on non-religion, and that the data, the findings, the chapters in our edited volume help answer. And so that question that I'm going to be focused on for the next 10 minutes or so is, how do the religious and non-religious coexist in the Pacific Northwest or in Pacific Northwest society? Right, so like Paul was mentioning, this is a region where there's large non-religious populations. So that's, like Paul said, it's about half the population. Here on the slide, you see British Columbia's religious affiliation composition according to the survey we ran, the more representative adult sample that we have for British Columbia. And so the 4 slices of the pie chart there in blue are all different forms of non-religion that we found through the survey, which make up about half the population. And then other categories that are quite prevalent in the region as well. But also on top of that, so this is for British Columbia, you find something very similar for the states of Washington and Oregon, very similar rates of non-religion. But on top of that, there's also quite substantial religious populations still in the region, or populations we typically think of as more religious in a kind of organized religion form. So are more actively involved with religious groups. So in British Columbia, it's about 20% of the adult population that is more actively religious. And in Washington and Oregon, it's about 31%, so about a third of the adult population who's more religious. So you really do have these kind of large groups on each side, right? So yes, a very kind of post-Christian environment in a sense, but that doesn't mean religion's disappeared. It means that there's a lot of coexistence going on between the kind of two ends of the religiosity spectrum, if you want. So there's a number, there's pretty much all the chapters in the book touch on non-religion in some way, right? Because it's such a big part of the region. But I did want to mention a few before I get into some of the stuff that I covered in my own chapter. There's chapter 4 that's written by Tina Block and Lynn Marks. And you can see the title here, but people tend to go the way of their families. The way the families go, irreligion across the generations in the Pacific Northwest. And Tina and Lynn show, and Pat will talk more about it later on, that no religion has a long history in the Pacific Northwest. It didn't just show up overnight. There's a lot of kind of irreligious family traditions, socialization that go on. And chapter 4 in the book really explores that in detail. So Tina and Lynn went and did a series of oral history interviews with a number of non-religious individuals and really delved into their family history, into how they live their non-religion in the region. So this is kind of a really interesting chapter to look at that kind of historical dimension of non-religion in the Pacific Northwest. My own chapter looks more at the present day. So my chapter is chapter 5, called Second to None, Religious Non-Affiliation in the Pacific Northwest. And so I'm looking at, what kinds of non-religion do we find in the region? Who is more in these non-religious demographics that we find? And I'm also interested in a region where you find such large non-religious and religious groups coexisting, how does that coexistence actually happen? How does it play out in everyday lived experiences, right? So back to that question, how do the religious and non-religious coexist in this Pacific Northwest society in British Columbia and the states of Washington and Oregon? Well, part of the answer is that they don't always see that much of each other in the region. There's an important trend here that in sociology we call a homophobia trend, where people tend to hang out with other people who are like themselves, right? So they kind of form, I don't want to call it quite silos because they do have contact with other individuals, but there's a trend that non-religious people tend to hang out with other non-religious people and tend to be from families who are also non-religious versus kind of the other end of the spectrum, or those who are more actively religious non-religious tend to have friends who are also actively religious and families as well. Now, this is a trend. It's not set in stone. There's obviously mingling between the different social networks here, but there is definitely a homophily trend in the Pacific Northwest when it comes to the non-religious. And these data up here on the slide are an indication of that, right? So we asked people about their 5 closest friends in the survey that we ran. And what we found was that, for example, the average number of friends that someone would have that respondent would describe as not religious at all, that average was higher amongst those respondents who were also non-religious. And in terms of terminology here, we're working with those who have no religious affiliation, but also those who are kind of non-religious on a variety of indicators that are, kind of more tied to more traditional forms of organized religion. So things like prayer, things like frequency of religious service attendance, and so forth. So active affiliates, so those who identify with a religious tradition and are quite active, participate quite regularly with a religious group. They do have some friends sometimes who are not religious at all, but on average, their friends are much more religious than what we find amongst those who have no religious affiliation, for example. Right. So that's one of the kind of findings that we see is that, well, there's coexistence, but they're not always in direct contact with one another, members of the two groups. But that being said, despite the homophily trend, the non-religious nevertheless do sometimes come into contact and interact with more religious persons, right? Either amongst their family, their friends, in the workplace, or in other social settings. So in that case, when that happens, what strategies are used by the non-religious in these different contexts? Right? How do those who have no religious affiliation in Cascadia bridge the religious and irreligious divide when needed in social spaces where large religious and non-religious groups coexist, right? And in the qualitative data that we gathered, especially, so the series of focus groups that we did, the oral histories that Tina and Lynn did, I kind of, in looking at that data, kind of found that there were especially 4 different strategies that came out for what I call it more like sociological speak, 4 strategies for microsocial interactions that seem to come up again and again in the qualitative data, right, that we conducted during the project. And I've got those 4 strategies illustrated here on the slide. I named these strategies. I gave them designations, again, not married to the names, but I felt that they represented the kind of different approaches non-religious individuals would have when interacting with more religious folk. All right, so one strategy is what I call outspoken disagreement. Another is quiet discomfort. Another still is quiet respect. And finally, a more kind of deep equality strategy. These 4 distinct approaches fall along 2 main spectrums, right? So whether or not the non-religious research participant would actually choose to say anything about religion or irreligion when they came into contact with a more religious individual, and how open or closed they would be towards that other person's religiosity. Some non-religious individuals may be prone to using one type of these strategies across most interactions they have with more religious persons, and others may employ different strategies across different contexts as needed, right? So it's not just because you're one individual that you adopt always the same strategy. It might vary depending on the situation, context, or other person you're interacting with. I want to take a few minutes here to give you an example of each of these 4 strategies. I think it's quite interesting. Now, obviously, before we get into that, there's obviously strategies that religious individuals might use when they're interacting with non-religious individuals, and they might actually be quite similar to these. That's future research is needed there. But here I want to really focus on the non-religious individuals, and because we did have quite a large number of individuals who were less or not religious at all in our research participant pool for this project. Okay, so let's start with this outspoken disagreement strategy. I give an example here of Mike. Mike is someone we interviewed, a self-identified atheist in his 50s from Seattle. And Mike provides us with an example of this outspoken disagreement strategy when discussing one of his more religious friends. And I've got the quote here that Mike uses. So Mike's talking about one of his Catholic friends who volunteers at a Catholic organization. So this friend, I quote Mike, this friend and I will talk about it, religion, because I'm always giving him gas about the grief that he gets from these Catholic people. And I said, you know, how can you live? How can you like volunteering and getting shit from these people? I said, it's because they can't help themselves. They've been processed by this church all these years later. They're in their 50s, 60s, and 70s, and they're still in that whole absolutist mindset. And you're outside of the box, right? He's referring to his friend here. They just can't handle that. So you need to find something different to do as far as putting yourself into some community or something like that, right? So here Mike is actively talking to his friend, his Catholic friend, about his thoughts about religion. And he obviously is not a big fan of what the Catholic Church does, and so is kind of more closed off to his friend's religious identification, as well as his active religiosity and volunteering in certain Catholic groups. So that's the kind of outspoken strategy that we would sometimes come across with our research participants. Then there's another strategy which I call quiet discomfort. And Robin, also a self-identified atheist, in his 70s this time from Vancouver, talks instead about this strategy, which is a more quiet strategy that's kind of more going on in his brain rather than being actually spoken to another person. If I run into someone who's religious and they're telling me a religious story, like my sister-in-law or something, I just kind of shrug it off, right? Like I don't go out afterwards after she's gone and like, put needles in a little doll or something. I just let it go. And because she does, she believes very seriously, as does her husband, in religion. And I just don't get it, right? And when we're at a family thing and he starts trying to tell me about some great thing he's heard or learned, I try to change the subject as quickly as possible, right? So talking about religion for Robin makes him uncomfortable. He doesn't necessarily outwardly say it, but he'll kind of like quietly like try and change the topic as soon as possible in his case, right? So a different strategy when confronted with more actively religious individuals, in this case, in his family. Then we have the third strategy of quiet respect. So here Kelly is an example of of a non-religious individual using quiet respect. All right, so Kelly doesn't identify with a religion, and Kelly is in her 20s and is from Seattle. And she speaks instead about her experience on this issue that more closely resembles what I call quiet respect. So to quote Kelly here, I can really only think of one friend who identifies as religious, and I wouldn't even consider it being a huge identifier for her. I think she goes to church very rarely. I think she went for Easter this year. So no, it's never something we've really talked about. I think it's something that's been approached, but nothing that we've ever dug deep into and had a full conversation about, right? So here in Kelly's quote, traces of that homophily trend, right? She's only got one friend that's sort of religious and isn't all that religious, according to Kelly. But Kelly's approach to that is not necessarily openly discussing religion with this friend, but rather staying quiet, but in a kind of maybe what I call a more respectful, or, some people might call it a more disinterested way of kind of not necessarily being openly aggressive towards this friend's religiosity. And then finally, I've got the deep equality strategy. All right, so Jaden, someone who has no religious affiliation and is in her 20s from Seattle, adopts this deep equality strategy, especially when she's discussing religion with one of her friends, right? So I'll quote Jaden here. I have another pretty close friend. I don't think she even realizes how much I love her, but she's also in the church, and she's a super free spirit. Like she's like my daily motivation on like how I want to be as a person, because she's just very loving, very caring. Just wants to participate in the community in any way she can. And she just motivates me so much. She respects that I don't go to church. We just can sit down and talk about religion, informs the way that she's working as a person, I guess, and that's just unique to my relationships and friendships with people, specifically with her and anyone I know that actively believes. I only want to be the most respectful of religion as I can be. So this deep equality strategy refers to when the non-religious individual openly discusses in an accepting manner someone else's religion, right? And I'm borrowing, as many of you might have figured out by now, the term deep equality from Lori's work, right? That Lori uses that kind of broader concept of deep equality. And just a moment. And defines deep equality as, and I'm quoting Laurie here from 2014, a vision of equality that transcends law, politics, and social policy, and that relocates equality as a process rather than a definition, and as lived rather than prescribed. It recognizes equality as an achievement of day-to-day interaction and is traceable through agonistic respect, recognition of similarity, and a simultaneous acceptance of difference, creation of community, and neighborliness. It circulates through micro processes of individual action and inaction and through group demonstrations of caring. So I kind of borrowed, that's obviously a broader concept, but use the term here for this specific strategy. Now, what's really fascinating here is that, we don't just find one strategy, we find many. And so I'm kind of trying to put up like 4 ideal types here that kind of cover the spectrum that we saw in the interviews. But I think there's real avenues here for future research if it interests anyone. Which ones are used more, right? We found like deep equality is definitely present, but the quiet strategies of, quiet, here, I'll move it up really. So quiet discomfort or quiet respect, those were the ones that we found the most amongst our research participants, our non-religious research participants. But that being said, we didn't necessarily, with the qualitative data, we didn't necessarily have a hugely representative sample of the whole population. So if you were to look at, across the population, which strategies might you find the most during their interactions with more religious individuals? And does the context of the Pacific Northwest, where non-religion is much more socially acceptable and normalized than perhaps elsewhere or other regions of North America, in that context, do we find certain strategies more than others? Like, for example, in a context where no religion is normalized, do we find the quiet strategies more because people don't, it's not as contentious of an issue. They feel comfortable just staying quiet about it. They don't necessarily need to feel that they need to confront individuals about being different from themselves if they feel comfortable in their kind of non-religion. Or on the opposite end, does it maybe, make them feel more comfortable with kind of expressing potentially open disagreement, or at the other end, maybe more deep equality, discussing it more with individuals. Maybe there's more comfort for that there. I think those are real kind of empirical avenues for future research that might be interesting and that touch on non-religion and how the Pacific Northwest may or may not be more distinct on these issues. Just to kind of wrap up here, I think there's one of the other chapters in the edited volume that really does touch on non-religion to a greater extent is Mark Silk's chapter. And Mark Silk really puts forward the argument here, Paul mentioned it a bit earlier on, that, the Pacific Northwest used to be exceptional, right? Used to be more of an exceptional case in North America. Non-religion had a long history in that region, was much more prevalent. But now, Mark says we're kind of transitioning from seeing the Pacific Northwest as an exceptional case to something that's much more kind of like a bellwether of what's to come. And so I think that's, again, another interesting avenue for future research is, how distinct is the Pacific Northwest? Do we find, for example, those 4 strategies of interaction elsewhere in North America and Europe? And in contexts where non-religion is more prevalent, is growing, is more present, do we kind of find certain types of strategies more prevalent and become more present than others? Okay, so that's all I had to say. So thank you so much, and I'll pass the mic over to Pat.
So I'm the historian of Christianity in the group, and I became interested in the NONES out of my interest in regional religion, once being a native of Oregon and then wandering around a bit after graduate school teaching and finally landing back in the Northwest. I became very aware of regional religion, and I'm always interested in trying to understand how regional context and larger national and global trends and particular forms of religious communities interact, and see what happens in the evolution both of religious bodies, but also in terms of what's going on in society. So part of what excited me about this project, and I want to publicly again thank Paul for inviting me to be part of it, was we were going to get qualitative data, and that's really where I focused the most in the material that I was working on. So a few things a reminder, and then I want to highlight some things out of the, particularly the qualitative data, the interviews, and the focus groups that I think have extended our understanding of religion in the region, but also offer areas for further research. So first of all, institutional religious participation has never been robust in Cascadia in the 150 plus years of Euro-American settlement. There's a long historical record of complaint. The Anglican Bishop George Hills in 1881 in BC spoke about the, quote, constitutional religious apathy that marked the people of the entire Pacific slope. A little more than a century later, Jeffrey Burns wrote that the history of Catholicism along the Pacific was, quote, the difficult task of inspiring indifferent people to devotion. Or if you want it in more humorous form, most of the denominations in the United States used to joke that the Rockies were white because so many people lightened their wagon loads by getting rid of their congregational transfer papers. So it's a complaint which one might think is simply a familiar trope of religious institutional leaders, but the data supports it. So in fact, from 1970 to 2000, the population of Oregon and Washington increased by 66%, and the religious adherent rate remained in the mid 30% range. 1971 to 2001, the population of British Columbia increased by 87%, and religious affiliation decreased from in the 80% down to 62. And as Sarah already mentioned, you've got about 31% of people religiously active in Washington, Oregon, 20% in British Columbia. So this irreligion and the presence of nuns has, it has a long tradition, and the Cascadia project explores how that has developed. The nuns trend younger, 48% in British Columbia and 36% in Cascadia South are under 35. They're less likely to be foreign born. They're more likely to be Caucasian. And the border matters here. In Cascadia South, there is an educational divide between the nuns and the religiously affiliated that does not exist in British Columbia. And although it's uncommon overall, Sarah points out in her work that in Cascadia South, you have slightly more participation on the part of the irreligious in what you could think of as organized groups, American Humanist Association, et cetera. And that has to do with the difference in the way religious organizations and religion function across the borders. Sarah already mentioned the chapter that Lynn and Tina did on intergenerational irreligion. And I think that chapter adds genuinely new understanding to what is a set of multiple causal explanations that get rolled out when we're trying to look at the irreligion of the region, from successive waves of migration, extractive economy, the grandeur of nature, what have you. The low institutional religious participation and identification affects the institutionally religious and the irreligious. And here I want to point out a couple things that became clear from our data, and particularly the qualitative data. So there are fewer social constraints, and people explore, switch, or disidentify. So some examples from our focus groups. So Nicole was raised Buddhist and became Jewish. Fiona, Buddhist, becomes Roman Catholic. Michelle is evangelical, becomes Anglican. Lindsay is a nun, becomes Christian. Dale's raised Protestant, becomes a Buddhist. Stephanie's an Episcopalian, becomes agnostic. Gloria's Anglican, becomes a nun. And Stanley goes from Catholicism to the Unification Church to Baha'i. So It's just the social constraint to be religious in some way is simply not there. Takes repeated choice to be active. Millennial Michelle, who is an Anglican, says, quote, I think people who are committed here are really, really committed. It's a repeated choice. One of the findings that I think is very significant that showed up in the families, not only of the irreligious, but of the religious across generation, is the primacy of and privacy of the individual's spiritual journey. So ascriptive factors carry less weight in people's religious identity. One example here is British Columbian Penny, who in 1974 converted from Anglican to Roman Catholic as a result of her experience in a women's retreat. She does this even though it breaks up the pattern of families going to church together. And she remains Roman Catholic her whole life. Her husband ceases to be an Anglican, but there is this effect on the family. But her wanting, and I quote her, a gut relationship with God took priority over the notion of religion being part of her family. Or similarly, Nicole in Portland, who switched from Buddhist to Judaism, had not at the time of our focus groups told her mother that she'd switched. So in this emphasis on privacy and primacy of the individual journey, one of the people interviewed was William, who was a Catholic in Portland. He had sent his 3 daughters to Catholic schools. None of them are practicing. He wishes he knew why, but when asked, did he ask? He says, quote, no, I never talked to my daughter about it. You know, it's her business. Or Linda, who's a liberal Protestant whose daughter got into Druidism with her family for a while and now is doing she knows not what, says, quote, she doesn't attend a church per se or have a specific belief. She may have something she could put down, but she hasn't shared it with me. And Linda wasn't going to pry. Or Henry, who raised his own sons the way he was raised, liberal Protestant in Portland, who said to them, quote, we don't care what you believe. We are not controlling your belief, but we are controlling your behavior until you leave home, which meant they would go to church. But if they didn't want to go to the church their parents went to, they could go to a different one, which is what Henry had done. I want to mention briefly a couple things about relationship of nature and religion. Reverential naturalism in the interviews and the focus groups was expressed by religious and irreligious alike. And there are really kind of 3 strands that run through the data that bear future examination. One is the notion that spirituality happens in and through nature, and religious congregation is where you have community. And one pastor complained about how he has congregants who will say, we won't be here next week because we're going hiking. And as he said, they expect brownie points for it. Among committed evangelicals, there is a kind of tension that gets expressed that perhaps people hear substitute nature for God, and that makes them uncomfortable. But then there is, running through the interviews, a sense of nature and inherited religious vision as mutually interacting in religious thought. And one of these people who writes this way is Roger, who describes how on his first trip out, he's going to have a ministry placement in the Puget Sound area. He spends some time at an uncle's cabin on the Methow River, and he sees salmon spawn. And he says, quote, that really was a conversion experience that's continued to drive a lot of the thinking I do. And that it, in fact, shaped his thinking theologically in his 35 years as a pastor. So I think Paul's reverential naturalism is an area where there's significant more work that can be done. And finally, I will close with just one comment here because I'm up against my time limit. The quest for community among the lonely and the free. And this has profound impact on people. One rabbi mentions that people want meaning and purpose that comes from being part of a community, but they want it with fewer obligations and less commitment. And another woman in her 30s from Seattle really envies her cousins from Minnesota who grow up in an extended family. And she talks about the isolation here and that she did not grow up in a setting where there were really a group of people you could have fewer boundaries with. So I will leave that there. In the chapter that I did, I worked some on these themes, but the book has an awful lot of interesting ideas and information that bears more exploration. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating. And I think you've covered a great deal of territory in a relatively short time. And I'm sure everyone is now completely intrigued by what you said and have been buying the book while you've been speaking, I'm sure. I know I can hardly wait to read it. So if people would post their questions in the Q&A, then I'll just pose the questions as I sort of work through them. And I'm not sure how you want to handle. I'll direct if there is a person specifically addressed, but you can sort maybe between yourselves who will handle, or you can all respond. Dear Sarah, Paul, and others, would you be able to comment on why the region might have become more a bellwether of what is to come rather than the exceptional part you mentioned before? And that's from Amy Verdun.
Thanks, Amy. Amy is a fellow at the center, so lovely to get that question. That's a good question. I mean, Patricia and Mark, who worked on the Nun Zone, which is where the idea of Cascadia being kind of way out on the edge and really kind of separate from what happens elsewhere in North America. She can speak more about that time period, which is maybe 15 years ago or so when they did that. But my sense is that it has something to do with social media, that I think that the boundaries between there and here are just more porous than they used to be. And I think that, as Sarah has pointed out in some of her other work, that once you start to have kids whose parents and maybe even grandparents didn't go to church or anything else, you begin to have this accelerating rate of irreligion. And so I think you're seeing some of that here too. But you're seeing it elsewhere as well. I think you're just seeing it like maybe 15 years more advanced here. I don't know, Patricia, what do you think about that shift?
Yeah. One of the intriguing ideas that some historians have written about is the Northwest was urban from the beginning, and that in some sense there is a kind of almost postmodern cosmopolitanism or features of that even in the 19th century. And secondly, that very few people immigrate here as the first place they immigrate. And so you have successive waves. Every time you move, it breaks social connections and you have to rebuild them. And that having so many people in multiple waves like that, we just have weak social institutions anyway. As I'll never forget one AP reporter when the Nun Zone book came out, he had lived and worked out here at the time he was in the East. And he said, yes, you don't even have durable enough social relationships to do organized crime well. And so there's, in a sense, maybe, I think this is a place where we've got a convergence of what Yves Lambert and others would talk about as global trends that are interacting. They're not as visible as here, even back when we did the earlier work.
Shall we go to the next question? Thanks, everyone. Abby Day has a question, and I had this question too. So Abby, thanks for posing this. She says, many thanks for this fascinating presentation. I'd love to hear more about generational and gender differences.
That would be a great Sarah question, and but lovely to hear you, Abby. Good to hear your name at least.
Yeah, I could take that one. Yeah, okay. So let's talk about gender differences first, because I think that's intriguing. In the Pacific Northwest, we see some, but maybe not as pronounced as we tend to see with non-religion and gender elsewhere in North America and other parts of potentially Europe, for example. So there are, the general trend is still present where women tend to, there's a smaller proportion of women who do not religiously affiliate. There's a slightly larger proportion of men who say they have no religion, and religiosity indicators are slightly higher amongst women than they are amongst men. That's your kind of, that trend's been around for a while. There's many people who've shown it, including you in your work, Abby. But it's not as strong as we expected, right? So I've seen it very strong in other parts of North America, like the south of the US, the Northeast, in other parts of Canada as well. Here, it's sort of still there, but it's like almost not significant in size anymore. There's only a small proportional difference between the genders. And so this is also, there's kind of emerging work in the non-religion field showing that as non-religion becomes more normalized, more social groups tend to feel comfortable saying they have no religion. Right. So there's like this at the forefront of no religion, when it's still a small, quite distinct group, it tends to be more white, more male, more university educated. People in positions of privilege and power feel more comfortable saying they have no religion. The social penalties they experience aren't as severe as, say, for example, amongst racialized women in more rural communities, for example. But, as non-religion takes kind of more and more space in society, as it becomes more normalized, those differences are still there a bit. They kind of echo across generations, but they do decline, it seems. It's we're still looking into that, but it does seem to be the case. And so we do see that to a certain extent in the Pacific Northwest, especially amongst younger generations, right, where non-religion is much higher. That general trend of what in David Voas's work calls secular transition, where the generation is the key variable and religious socialization declines over generations. And so you have a larger and larger non-religious population amongst younger demographics. It's definitely there in the Pacific Northwest. It seems to have started earlier in the Pacific Northwest than, say, in Ontario, Quebec, as well as in central or southern US. But that process is still present. And those demographic effects also seem to be a bit tied to that generational process. So amongst younger generations, there are still some distinctions in terms of gender, but they're very weak now. There's a large proportion of women now feel comfortable, it seems, to say they have no religion or no religious affiliation. The one effect that does still remain very important in the Pacific Northwest is the race variable, right, is race and ethnicity. The non-religious population in the Pacific Northwest is still very white, much more white on average than the general population, especially in urban centers. And so that variable is still very present, and it's now the kind of main demographic distinctive variable, if you want, between those two kind of religious and non-religious populations, much more so than gender is now. Yeah. Anyone want to add anything to that?
Well, can I ask something actually, Sarah? And this may be something that other people have asked, but I wonder, Sarah, if you could anticipate, because a lot of the non-white folks in the region are they themselves, or at least their parents, still have accents, right? So if we follow Peter Byer's work and some of your work in the past, if we think about them in the second and third generation, in other words, when there's no more accents and maybe just their grandparents have accents, are you imagining then that they would follow the path of the millennials and others we're seeing today, where there's such a low cost, there's such a low social cost or familial cost to saying, no, not really, I don't do that thing?
Yeah, the social environment definitely has an effect, right? That's what you're talking about, right? Like that they're now in a context 2 or 3 generations, maybe after immigration, amongst, say, Muslim families, Sikh families, and other groups, that, yeah, there's definitely a larger proportion of youngsters who will either have kind of only kind of cultural or weaker ties to religious groups or none at all. But that decline, it takes longer amongst those demographics. It does happen, but it's not to the same degree as you see amongst the kind of European settler white populations who've been either in the region for many generations or who have, recently arrived to a generation but come from families who are also non-religious, or parts of Europe who are less religious, right? So yes, I think there is a certain effect, but I think you'll still see that race and ethnicity variable be important for a number of generations to come, because it takes a while, and obviously then you have to like separate out first generation immigration, second generation immigration, because it's still, that immigration is still feeding that group more than others. And so, it's there, but I think it'll last a lot longer, say, than the gender variable will. I think the gender variable in the next birth cohort or generation in the Pacific Northwest, I don't think you'll see almost any gender differences, right? So.
Thanks. Sorry, Laurie, for inserting myself there.
Paul, I mean, you have so many questions left, and we have 4 minutes left. So I'm like, no, Paul,
sorry. I'm sure
I'm
somebody was going to ask that question.
Can't you people call each other on the phone or something and talk about your work? Like, really? No. Paul, I'm sure everybody's really interested in what you asked. And there are a lot of questions along these lines. So Noel Schul and Dusty Hosley both asked about race and, as Noel put it, ancestral diversity. And there are just so many great questions here. And I do apologize to everyone. I'm not going to get to them all. But there's one that I think is really interesting. Paige Toms writes about class. I'm just going to, so I liked the way though that Paige put the question. So I see one of the things you're thinking about is whether people of different social classes experience or express reverential naturalism differently. Was class a part of your research for any of you? So this can be directed at any of you. Do people without a lot of leisure time, perhaps working multiple jobs, while they may have the same access to the ocean or the woods, think about the outdoors in the same way? Has reverential naturalism, the kind you might get from being in your kayak, for example, become like yoga, something for the middle upper classes? I think that's a great question, Paige.
Yeah, it's an excellent question. And the short answer is we didn't trace that very thoroughly. That is, I think, a question that we would need to be pursued in future research. I think what Paige is intuiting there, I think is probably quite correct, that especially in Vancouver and Victoria, which any time you go into any coffee shop, all you hear is people talking about housing prices. It's just gone really, it's just a really painfully unaffordable place to live. So as a result, those people who are working 2, 3, 4 jobs to make a go of it in this region, and it's not unlike Seattle, do they have time for a long hike? I mean, the reality is though, in as much as they have time for anything, the hiking and the being at the beach and so forth is free or inexpensive. That doesn't mean you still have to get there. You still have to be properly attired and fed and so forth. So it's not irrelevant, the class question, but I think there's something about the region that makes the natural environment much more accessible than it because it's not that hard to get to it.
Anyone else on that question? There's so many good questions left, so I'm just going to plow ahead. Alistair Hay writes, and he's already read parts of most of the book, he says. So, we would know this about Al. Al is already on it, and it's a fabulous read. He says, should we think of reverential naturalism as generally a single idea or something much more various, such that atheists, agnostics, the SBNR, and the religious will have different interpretations of it? But I want to ask his follow-up question, because I think this is that goes to the crux and the heart of the matter. Are we to assume that hints of the transcendent are always present?
I don't know. In the narratives people use, the way people talk about what being in the natural environment means to them, some people would use language that has this traditional transcendent metaphysical quality to it, and others would simply change their tone, change their rhetoric with regard to how they think about or talk about being on the beach or being in the kayak or being in the park. And it's paying attention to that shift in tone that I think is probably more interesting than paying attention to big, transcendent ideas. again, people who have a religious background, capital R religious background, will very naturally go there rhetorically. But for the increasing number of people for whom there's just that is just not their linguistic background, right? They're just not going to go there. And yet, when they talk about being out in the world, in the woods or on the beach, they talk about it in a way they don't really just talk about a nice restaurant or a good pair of boots. It's a different tone, and I'm trying to pay attention to that tone shift. But I don't have a kind of Eliadian sense that there's these little bits of the transcendent popping up, and I just need to notice it. I don't think that's necessarily what's happening. If that's what I don't know if that's what he's tracing. I need to know this fellow more if he's already read it and the book.
You do know Al Hay. He's a partner on the project, so
Okay.
I think you've met him virtually. But in this last couple of years, it's hard to get to know each other.
Yeah.
This is just killing me. I think we're out of time, and we have great questions from Jennifer Selby, Metanarrative, Alexander Zamusinski. Sorry, Alexander. So we're gonna end things there, and hopefully those people who have questions who haven't had a chance to pose them will contact you directly and pose them. There are more questions that I haven't been able to get through, so people are really Matthew Polnick, I apologize, you had a number of questions, so I apologize to all of you, but if Paul hadn't asked that question, I mean, we could have got
My bad. Laurie, if people do want to pose those questions, we're having an actual book launch May 5th? A more traditional book launch, and there will be a feed, like a YouTube or Facebook or whatever feed, if people can't come in person. So
excellent.
Check out our website.
I suspect Emma may also be doing a promo for that in her closing remarks. I'm not sure. But yes, please, everyone, go to the more traditional book launch because you'll have a chance to pose your questions again. And I think they should give you priority if you go because you weren't able to get in on it today. So thank you to each and all of you for this wonderful conversation. I think it's quite obvious there's a great deal of interest in your book. I am certainly interested, and Al has now put me to shame for not having read it before I got to this panel. So I will have to do that. And congratulations. It's a wonderful project. It makes an important contribution to the literature, and I'm so delighted that it's out. So thank you again. And Emma, over to you for a closing wrap up, a few sets of comments.
Thank you, Laurie. Thank you so much, Paul, Patricia, and Sarah for your engaging presentation. Thank you to our attendees for joining us for today's event and for your enthusiasm. As Paul said, the CSRS is hosting a book launch on May 5th. I've shared a link in the chat. You can also find more information on their website, also available in the chat. The NCF also has an upcoming event on May 10th. It's a Meet the Author event with Elaine Howard Eklund. There's a registration link, surprise, in the chat as well. Thank you all so much for being here today. I want to quickly thank the NCF's information officer, Amy Saville, for all their hard work promoting today's event. And I would also like to thank Mike at U Ottawa, who has been handling tech for today's event. We really appreciate you all attending today, and we hope to see you again soon. Thank you so much.